This is the Denison Forum podcast. I'm Dr. Mark Turman, the Executive Director of Denison Forum, here again with Dr. Jim Denison. Jim, how are you today?
Hey, Mark, I'm doing well. Thanks for the privilege.
You bet. Great to have you here and for another conversation. And we're joined today by Father Barry Montgomery, who I'd like to introduce to you today. He is the rector of Christ the Redeemer Anglican Church in Rowlett, Texas, just east of Dallas. He has also been in ministry, has worked in children and youth ministry in California, which could probably be a story-rich environment, no doubt. He is also a retired major from the U.S. Marine Corps, having served from 1991 to 2011. Part of his experience and responsibility there was to be an intelligence instructor and faculty administrator at the Expeditionary Warfare School in Quantico, Virginia. He has been deployed 5 times to Iraq and also to Mogadishu. He was educated, got his undergraduate degree at Louisiana State University in history and also a master's degree in divinity and ministry from Azusa Pacific University. Probably most importantly for us to know, he is married to Mary since 1991, has 3 children and 1 grandson, probably arguably the greatest grandchild on the planet, right?
Absolutely, yes. I think the sun rises on him, the moon, everything kind of revolves around.
Well, and if we need to have an arm wrestling conversation about grandchildren right now, we can do that, right?
We're all 3 willing to do that, absolutely.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Right.
So the story of how Father Barry got here to be with us today, thank you so much for doing this, is not long ago, Mark and I were doing one of these lunch and learn events, as we call them. We had invited ministers in the area to come over to an area called the Hope Center, just north of Dallas. And I was there to talk about the coming tsunami and have discussion about what this cultural narrative could mean to the culture. Well, Chris Elkins, with whom I've been working for 24 years now, a very dear friend of mine and very active member of Father Barry's church, had asked if Father Barry could just come along, could just come and be a kind of ride over with us to the thing and back. I'd wanted to meet him anyway. I'd heard such good things about him. But I did not know. I knew that you had a military background. I didn't know the degree to which you had spent so much time in military intelligence specifically. So I just began asking Father Barry questions in the context of the Ukrainian and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, how he saw that, how he saw it maybe moving forward. What were some insights he might have in that space that could be helpful for us as Americans and then as Christians? And the conversation to me was so fascinating that I came back and asked if it would be possible if we could have a conversation with you in a podcast setting like this. So all you were trying to do is have lunch, and looks what's happened to you now.
And maybe get a free book.
Maybe get a free book, and now you're stuck in a room with 2 Baptist preachers in this table. I expect you to do quite well on your own in the midst of all this. But I am so grateful to you, Father Barry, for doing this, for being part of this conversation with us.
Thank you, Jim. It's my honor. I really was surprised and very honored by you asking me to do this. It's a pleasure. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Very, very kind of you. So I guess we could begin, if it's all right, just by asking you for some insight that you might just have as you're watching what's happening right now in the Ukraine, given your background and experience. What is it that comes to mind for you? What do you see happening there from a military analytical perspective?
Well, it is an interesting situation because what I'm observing is that largely I still want to say Soviet. Russian doctrine doesn't appear to have changed a great deal from Soviet doctrine. It is still very armor-centric. It is, yes, well, they say combined arms. Combined arms is what is a crucial element of most Western military doctrines, certainly the United States and the Marine Corps in particular. But what is interesting is the things that are not necessarily lining up with what I would expect out of this move. And it calls into question some of the ideas that I think people are floating out there about what Putin might be doing. To begin with, logistically, they don't appear to have been really well prepared for as long of an operation as it's taking. The thing looks like he legitimately thought that they were going to run in there, and I know they wanted to secure, or at least my belief is that they wanted to secure that eastern area that has more Russian, ethnic Russians in it.
The Donbass area and that type of thing.
Yeah. And I think that was essential for them to get for PR reasons and that kind of thing. But beyond that, I think that he was expecting to roll, or he and his generals, and it is not, I don't want to necessarily call his military planners wrong. The construct of what appears to be the operation looks very sound because they are going for key areas that they need to secure. They got the Donbass area. They have started to isolate. I think they're, at last estimates, are 2 or 3 days away from fully encircling Kiev. They've got, they're on the verge, and what's delaying them, I have no idea. They're on the verge of moving on Odessa, and when they do that, they have cut Ukraine off from the ocean. They've completely changed the chessboard. As a friend of mine actually used that expression when Odessa falls. So, but what's interesting in all of that is with the way they've structured this, I think number one, they underestimated the response of the Ukrainians, and I think that in that underestimation, they underprepared logistically. So there's also things that we suspected or knew about going all the way back to when I was a second lieutenant, and I remember hearing about this when the old Soviet Union was still around, is the Soviet Union and the Russians, by extension, rely very heavily on their average soldier is a conscript, and these guys they're not super well trained. You can expect a certain variation in whether they're really good or really bad, but generally speaking, they don't live up to the level of what we come to regard, or even Europe comes to regard as their normal infantry and armor personnel, that kind of thing.
Which is kind of astounding for me to hear you say that, really, from a standpoint, because what that sounds like to me is, on paper, this kind of what looked like was going to be shock and awe looked like it was drawn up right. We're going to attack from 3 sides, and
Exactly.
and we're going to isolate the areas like you said. So on paper it looks like that, but it doesn't. We're now 12 or so days in, not going that way. But to hear you say that, their training and their expertise is not what a common person like me might have thought. It's pretty surprising, really.
It's actually a disease that I think we've had with the Soviets for 60, 70 years. We always regarded them as this big, and they were big in terms of numbers. And that is another surprising part about this operation, is that you go back to World War II, the Soviets have, and now the Russians, typically, there's a weight of numbers. So weight of numbers, very, very armor-centric, that kind of thing. And that was one of the things we trained to when I was a lieutenant. In dealing with Soviet infantry was normally mechanized infantry. They were very attached to their armored personnel carriers. It's what you see a lot of that with BMPs and things that are on the roads today in Ukraine. You'll see them pop up. And the troops begin, by lack of training, by socialization or whatever, they become very devoted to that particular 8-wheeled vehicle or tracked vehicle. And what it does is it very much limits their effectiveness as an infantryman. And they've always had these really, I don't know, speaking before my time, I can't say, but by the time I was being taught this, it was pretty obvious that they had some significant weaknesses in those types of regard. And that has carried forward. And I don't see, there's no reason for it not to have carried forward. Because, again, the mindset that goes back 70, 80 years was that the average trigger puller was cannon fodder. You put all of your real weight behind the artillery. You put the weight behind your special forces, which was there's so many little things. The Spetsnaz element, or the special forces element of this, is also surprising in this campaign. But you just fill the boots and you put those guys out there.
So is that? Tell me if you know. I never even had this thought or question before. So is every adult or every adult male conscripted, drafted into the military?
I don't believe that's the case anymore. In the Soviet Union, there was those requirements, even to the point where, the Soviet national hockey team all had to be, they were all an element of the Soviet Army. So that used to be the case. I don't believe that's the case so much anymore, but they still use conscription. And most of what you can expect in the conscription are the poor kids, the guys that aren't going to technical, aren't going to higher levels of education. They're not going to be nuclear scientists or something like that the state puts a lot of importance upon. And And the one thing you can say about them is that they're very tough because their training is very brutal. Something that it worries me in terms of if the West and the East ever come into a clash. I think they're toughened up to a degree that we may not be doing any longer in this country. And I'm not endorsing brutality, but that's a whole discussion for a different day. But the thing is that you have a set of problems that come from just having conscripts as your troops. Those guys, generally speaking, aren't going to show a lot of initiative. They're going to be much more reactive to, gee, I didn't get fed. I'm thirsty. I'm tired. I'm cold. And depending on the degree of leadership above them, they're just as apt to sit in that vehicle when it's sitting on a road stuck in a convoy for days on end without ever thinking to do anything else. So that in and of itself limits the situation.
And that's what we're seeing.
And that's what we're seeing.
Exactly that right now. 40-mile-long convoys stuck in the mud, no one figuring out what to do. To me, that's also a worldview illustration, if I could. Now, this is me being a philosopher trying to be a military intelligence guy here, but I've just finished reading a really interesting history of Russia, in which they talk about the beginning of the Tsar back in the 16th century, Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, Tsar being a derivative of Caesar, and this idea that what you've got to have here is this Tsar and these oligarchs that are going to rule with him, and they're very corrupt, and he supports them, they support him, because really most of Russia is peasants.
Right.
Most of Russia are living in the villages. They're living on the fields. They don't have access to education. They've not really experienced the Enlightenment. They've not really been to a scientific revolution. If you get out, a lot of it's a third world country from what I'm reading. I've only been to the major cities, or primarily St. Petersburg in Russia. I've not seen really, but everything I've heard is you really think you're back 100 years or so. And so it makes sense now that you say it, that if that's where we're getting our soldiers from, conscripting them, and if they're willing to be conscripted, I guess, but primarily because it's a way out of those villages. But again, no initiative. We're waiting for the Tsar to tell us what to do, as it were, Then as a result, you'd see the kind of bogging down that we're seeing right now. And if you've got a Tsar who really thinks that because he has a nuclear armament behind him and because he's got shock and awe and 140,000 troops, he can roll over the Ukrainians, and he thinks that they're really just a State of the Union anyway. He thinks that they're just kind of a minor league or just kind of a farm team and all of that sort of thing. You would think that he would think he could therefore pretty quickly accomplish what he wanted, topple the government, put in some kind of a puppet to himself, and call it good. Well, none of that's turning out to be that way, is it?
No, and I think that just exactly what you're saying. I think they thought that they were going to roll through pretty quickly. I feel like there was a lot of underestimation of the Ukrainians. I think there was a lot of overestimation of their mechanical and their logistical readiness. You don't ever, I spent part of my infantry time in light armored infantry where we had LAVs and we were using light armored vehicles, and the mechanical readiness of your vehicle is really, really important, obviously. And with that convoy, that 40-mile long convoy sitting for a prolonged period of time, one of the things I wonder at is I guess it speaks to the fact that maybe the Ukrainians don't have as much ability or weapons to reach out and touch it as I thought they might, because American doctrine, American response would be to hammer it from every direction that we possibly could. But the fact that it's just sitting there and it's this plumb target tells me that probably a lot of those vehicles are broken down, or they're out of fuel, or there's some.
I was going to say, number one is that I can't ever remember. Not that I have a lot of experience, but never have heard of anybody having a 40-mile long convoy, and all you have to have is one breakdown on a narrow road.
There you go.
In the first 5 vehicles to create a major problem. Not to mention if your enemy happens to have a few anti-tank shoulder-mounted rockets, you can do a lot of problems to a 40-mile convoy.
You most definitely can, and you're right. And you look at the terrain in which they're moving; that they've got all these vehicles essentially trapped on the road. And oh my goodness, I keep waiting, and maybe press coverage doesn't hit it or what, but I keep waiting to hear that, just like you said, that some enterprising Ukrainians have gotten through there, and they've got their javelins, and they just go to town, because that was something that we trained to those types of things all the time when I was an infantry guy. And so yeah, but I think that stands as kind of a sign to us about their logistical problems, shortcomings in the operational level of the planning, that they expected to move so fast that all they did, and that's another thing that from American perspective, unless you are absolutely limited to the utmost degree, you don't ever plan to pack your entire force on one road and try to send it in there, because it is, again, just an enormous target. And so why didn't they choose multiple axes? Maybe there aren't multiple axes in that area. I don't have maps that I haven't been able to look at that, but it just seems like an enormous shortcoming on their part. And they're stuck. And now the interesting thing too is they're becoming stuck, and they're stopping short of Kiev. Makes you wonder, and I have my suspicions about this, but it makes you wonder what are their exact intentions upon the city. From what reports say, I think I said earlier, they're saying that they probably will have the city surrounded, essentially into a siege state in the next 2 or 3 days. And but then what are they going to do? I mean, you're going to sit there for a long time and try to starve the people out. They can try that. It depends, and I don't know the numbers of forces they're putting around that city, so you don't know how effective they're going to be in sealing the city off. If they can't starve them out, then it leaves the Russians in a really bad predicament, because in the back of every Russian head, I think, and particularly in the back of the heads of the officers and the planners and all that, is Grozny. Do we go in here and do we end up in another situation like we had in Chechnya? I think there's a real aversion. I know there's got to be a real political aversion to that because of what it caused in the country. So they're going to try to avoid that. And doctrinally, the Soviet way is, if we can't starve you out, we'll flatten the city. But that is not the most effective thing either, because when you flatten the city, you don't necessarily kill everybody, and you give the forces all that much more cover and concealment to work within. So so I think they've got I think they've got quite a problem on their hands, depending on how Kiev plays out. But I think it's going to be interesting to see, up to this point, as you mentioned, the different axes of advance coming from the 3 different sides, the way that they've come at it represents good planning. But you're only employing about 180,000 troops on a country that's the size of Texas. That's really not a lot of forces. And you're not in great tank territory in a lot of that area. And again, they're very armor-centric. We've seen also another old-style Soviet doctrinal thing, and it's obviously a part of their current doctrine, is they don't mind killing as many civilians as they can, because the more pain, the greater level of distress that you put on the nation that forces them to capitulate, the better. So, I don't think that there was ever any consideration to doing anything other than what they're doing right now, which is indiscriminately, artillery strikes, missile strikes, what have you. But they didn't count on, and probably I don't want to sound, this sounds trite, but I don't think they counted on Zelensky actually having the backbone that he has, and they have the same problem with Zelensky and particularly with the Ukrainians that they had with the Chechens, is that you have people here, they have the home field advantage, and they're willing to die, they're willing to fight. That's what made Chechnya really, in essence, kept Russia bogged down from 1994, December of 1994 until I think they finally declared everything kind of between the 2 Chechen wars, finally called it finished around 2011 or 2010. So that's almost the span of my Marine Corps career. They were still tied down and messing with Chechnya. And Chechnya, you've got, I don't know, just a few million people there. Now you've got
much smaller than Ukraine.
A much bigger situation than Ukraine.
Yeah.
So it is a, it's intriguing. I think that probably my expectation would be that they're going to try to do the siege of Kiev. They're going to go ahead and probably at some point they're going to try and grab Odessa, because if they don't grab Odessa, they leave them. They don't complete what is going to be the essential encirclement to weaken the nation, to get it to capitulate to them. But they don't have enough forces to actually get a full-on surrender of all the people. And I went into this thinking, and I've always, for a long time now, I've held Putin kind of in my mind. I think Putin sees himself as the new czar. I think it's...
His inner circle even calls him that, from what I read. Yeah.
So, and that you can take that back, like you were saying, you can go back
Peter the Great.
to Peter the Great. And that is that idea that we're going to build this empire, and we're going to compete with the West and all these kind of things. And Putin, he has, which is really ironic, and I'm not here to throw rocks at American leadership, but it's been amazing how misread Putin has been by American politicians.
He's been straightforward about this for 20 years. He really has.
He's blamed America for a lot of the Chechen things that happened. And yet we had presidents who still wanted to smile and say, oh, he's a wonderful guy.
Well, I remember our conversation at lunch as you were making the point, and I so agreed with it and do as well. A lot of us are misreading this to think he wants to rebuild the USSR, and he doesn't. He's not trying to build a communistic, atheistic sort of ideology to take over the world kind of a thing. He wants to rebuild the Russian Empire.
That's it.
He thinks he's Peter the Great. He really wants to extend that. And to do that, the first thing he's got to do is get back the part that was the empire, and that's Ukraine. Then he's got to build what used to be the Warsaw Pact to the west of that, so as to create a kind of a buffer between himself and Europe. He looks at these NATO countries as being on his border now, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, the same way we in World War II might have looked if Germany had conquered Canada.
Right.
And now they're on our border. He sees it in all those same kinds of terms and sees this as an existential threat. He's been saying this a long time. And so it's really, in one sense, as horrible as it is to say, it's good news that he and they have not been able to execute on their plan as well as had been thought relative to other countries that are NATO countries. Right. If they do invade a NATO country and Article 5 obligates us to be on the ground, we've got a real problem here. But on one level, it's good to know that they are not as effective a ground force as some might have thought going in.
And I would tell you this. I don't think that Russia, and by no means am I ever going to be an apologist or anything for them,
sure.
But I don't know if Putin or Russia would be anywhere near as dedicated to grabbing a piece of real estate as they are to the Ukraine because of the historic dynamic of
absolutely
Kiev having been a capital of the Russian Empire. This is ground that, in his czarist thinking, this belongs to us.
This is us. So, that's the State of the Union as we would see it.
Exactly.
That seceded.
Right.
As it were. And so, and they've got they've got the nationalities at work here. They've got the ethnicities, all that sort of thing. So you're right. He wouldn't feel that way about Estonia or Latvia. And so it wouldn't fit the narrative quite as well.
Yeah, so let me, for those that are listening to this podcast that are not particular historians, but I can hear some out there saying, well, I never really make much of a distinction between a Soviet and a Russian. So clear that, either or both of you clear that up a little bit because it just feels a little bit to me like the average person going to go, well, I thought it was all the same thing. Russia are Soviets and Soviets are Russians, and clear that up a little bit for us. Okay,
the Soviet Union, which was established initially after the Russian Revolution or the Soviet Revolution in 1917, 1918, grew and expanded, and of course after World War II, it encompassed the Eastern Europe and most of the Russian Asia over to the northern borders with China and that kind of thing. And it was the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, a number of different countries, different languages, different races, and certainly religions. One of the biggest ongoing problems they had were the number of Muslim nations that were along the southern arc of it. And but that's another great topic to talk about at some other time. But what we're talking about in terms of the Russian Empire is the Russian Empire that was the Tsarist Empire that goes back the 16th century kind of thing, and that
Peter
was
the Great.
Peter the
Great. And Rus
and
itself that started in the 9th century.
Right.
A thing called Rus, which is where Russian comes from. And then, as you're saying, it expands to Ivan the Great, the first Tsar, and then ultimately Peter the Great, St. Petersburg, named for Peter the Great, who really created of these disparate sort of land masses, this massive thing that we would think of as Russia now.
So in the mindset of Putin, I heard someone say that he had put a picture of Peter the Great in his office.
Right.
But it's important to realize that when he thinks of the Soviet Union, that's almost like a minor thing to him compared to what he's looking in the larger scope of a longer frame of history, right?
Yeah. The Soviet Union to him represents a failed entity, and It did provide. Now, we can't ever underestimate the impact of his being a KGB officer, lieutenant colonel in the KGB in the Soviet Union. We can't underestimate the amount of mental, preparation, indoctrination, and all of that. There's certainly a lot that comes into play there. But in terms of him looking geographically at the ground, he's seeing. He wants to harken back, and I think Peter the Great is the best example. He wants to go back to those glory days. He wants Russia, and he's open about it. He wants Russia to be, one of the power empires on this earth. Certainly better and in competition with us, which is very interesting now that he's making deals with the Chinese, who also have that kind of a valid interest. And so he's not interested in necessarily going back to this ideological driven type of situation, which was in so many ways. And the more we find out, we're still learning so much even today because of finally records being released and all this. It was such a disaster in so many ways what the Soviet Union was. He's not really interested in that. He's interested in building back and doing it right and trying to erase centuries of bad czars, building the Russian Empire back up to be a modern, and it is interesting with him because in spite of his Sovietness, and I don't know, I've never been able to ascertain whether there's an act involved or not, but I think he uses the Russian Orthodox Church so often. I think that there is an element there that he sees Russia and the Russian people, and because of the centrality of the Russian Orthodox Church, he sees them as this as the best expression of modern society, with Christianity at its heart and this kind of thing, albeit their interpretation of Christianity. And I know that's one of the things he hasn't been shy about, is mentioning the decline, the decay, the rot of the West in moving away from Christianity and in all the varieties of different things. That's come up with some of the protests.
Yeah, that's a massive piece of this. I'm so glad you talked about that. That's really hard for us to understand. I've been studying Russian history lately in the light of all of this, and I've seen in even clearer terms that they really do have a narrative that would say that when you're thinking about the church, you start in Rome, obviously, the Roman Catholic Church, then you move to the east to Constantinople or Byzantium or now Istanbul, and now to Moscow. They think of Moscow as the third Rome. They really do believe that not just Orthodox in the sense of denominational Eastern Orthodoxy, but Orthodox Christianity now resides in Russia. They see themselves that way. So they'll call Moscow the third Rome and the second Jerusalem. And they will make the claim that the Russian Orthodox Church is the finest, clearest, purest expression of biblical Christianity on earth. And not only the preservers of what they think of as biblical morality, but therefore as a means of someday blessing the world with. And there's some arguments here. Yeah. They tend to be much more conservative relative to social issues than the West. There was some, I forget what the athletic contest was a couple years ago in Russia, wasn't the Olympics, but like the Olympics, and made the news that they wouldn't allow gay demonstrations there. They wouldn't allow LGBTQ activism to be part of all of this. They, even in the Soviet Union, they had a brief experimentation with allowing for abortions and downgrading marriage, and they saw how catastrophic that was. So they moved back to a position against abortion, a position for marriage, and all of that very much in line with the Russian Orthodox Church.
Would you also say that that's what we might call a more conservative version of Christianity, but enforced by power?
That's where the two come together in so many ways. And the first Tsar saw this, and Peter the Great saw this, that the Russian Orthodox Church is the mortar that holds the bricks together. It's the same. I think it's the reason Constantine legalized the church in the 4th century, because the Roman Empire is falling apart, and he sees Christianity as mortar to hold the bricks and to seek the blessing of God on the people. Marx called religion an opiate of the people, and I think some of that is at play here as well. Putin himself is a very public member of the Russian Orthodox Church. He attends services. He calls himself a believer. I don't know, but that's what he calls himself in that space. And he's made an absolute alliance with the Archbishop of the Russian Orthodox Church. And a lot of the criticism these days is that the Orthodox Church is not standing up against these atrocities as it should, and it's because of this partnership, I think.
Well, even his reaction to, and I won't say the name of the group because it's somewhat offensive, but the three women in the rock group that in their protest against Putin, was about 10 years ago, I guess now, they did a video, they did a performance in a Russian Orthodox church. That's what got them locked up. Putin was irate about the very fact that they would insult the Russian Orthodox Church and that they would be there. And of course, theirs was kind of a pansexual message and all this kind of thing that so he does take that very seriously. And I absolutely agree with you on the mortar that holds it all together. And that's a lesson, too, that I think Putin learned with the fall of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union had none of that. And you had you had any number of Christians that were worshiping secretly and all this, but you had no, Soviet communism was bereft of anything other than the state. And they found out over decades, not just when we saw it come apart in the 80s, but they found out over decades that this is just a very bad, it's a facade put on a really, really bad situation.
So there sounds to be, from what you're saying, a large religious faith motivation behind what he's doing in Ukraine in some ways, or at least a justification.
That's the word I would use.
A justification behind it.
Yeah.
That is apparently playing well among the Russian people.
Well, it is playing well, but Russia has another problem that dates back to Chechnya, really, and then also to lesser extent when they went after Georgia and all this. When they start, well, I should say Afghanistan, actually. When they start seeing these boys coming back, and you have the leadership structure, and that group around Putin, you would expect, because of the kind of his czarist tendencies, is kind of an echo chamber for him. But even the layers around that are nationalistic and all of this kind of thing, and are largely bought into where he's going. But outside of that, and then when you get down to the average mom and dads out there, and this is something Putin doesn't enjoy from what the Soviets had, but the Soviets would shut all that down and no one had a chance to complain. They did have, they had lots of protests and lots of reactions to Grozny in particular in Chechnya when that debacle took place. So I think he has to be concerned that yes, on the one hand, I think everyone could kind of tacitly go, yes, having a great, strong Russian Empire, good Christian Russian Empire would be wonderful. Then they look at this, and of course he has shut off the reporting and all that kind of thing.
Even inspecting cell phones.
Right.
Yeah. And that's what he's starting to see now. Even today, he was giving a speech to the mothers. And that's Russian mothers. That's what he's going to have to worry about, exactly as you say. It's in my article, actually, for tomorrow, that only 4% of Russians blame Russia for this. 2/3 blame NATO or the U.S. or Ukraine, and that'll all hold up until we start seeing body counts on the other side. And now we're saying, well, now, wait a minute. Why was this worth my son's life?
That's exactly.
Vietnam is a good example.
There you go. Yeah.
And,
in fact, Chris and I were talking on the way over here that one of the things that we learned, or I shouldn't say we learned necessarily, but the Soviets learned and the Vietnamese learned and everyone else learned during the Vietnam War, is that America, our center of gravity, is our population and is our will to win, that kind of thing. And because we lose that long drawn-out war there without ever losing it militarily, but we lose that war. Same kind of thing that happens here. And I think, I never want to be guilty of saying, inside every Russian there's a little American wanting to get out. None of that kind of ridiculousness. But there is the commonality of parents losing children, and there is the commonality that they have more freedom of expression now. And yes, they're going to look and they're going to say, because there's always a degree of truth that's going to get out among the people. And when too many moms and dads have had to put too many of their boys in the ground, they're going to start asking, well, why were we even there? What did the Ukrainians do for us to have to go do this? That's when things get dicey for Putin, because he doesn't have that totalitarian architecture around him that I think he would love to have.
That's where he would wish he was in the Soviet Union.
That's right, exactly.
So does this turn to an occupation next?
Yeah. I think that's exactly where it's going. But
are they going to find that's much more difficult than they expected?
Absolutely.
In light of what they're learning here.
The wild card in it is Zelensky. Is more Zelensky. A lot of it depends, because I think they will take Odessa, and I think they will finish the encirclement of Kyiv, and they will go ahead and get themselves as oriented as they have planned to get. Of course, they can't pacify the whole country. They can't do that kind of an occupation. But I think what they're going to try to do is get Zelensky, get his government, get it out, get it killed one way or another eliminated. Once they've done that, now they can turn around and they can do what they ultimately were able to do in Chechnya, which was to get a pro-Russian government in place, and then it turns into a lower level type of occupation. Then we turn around, we start rebuilding, we make ourselves look good, and oh, by the way, the government is going to toe the line for us. If Zelensky doesn't get killed, if he and his guys find a way to stick on, hang on and maintain an ongoing guerrilla type of asymmetric war here, then it's going to be bad. It's going to be really, really hard for the Russians to justify it because they don't have the force levels to stop that. So, I mean, in my thinking, Zelensky needs to get if it gets untenable in Kiev, and if he can get out, which of course is a good question in terms of how effective they are isolating it, but if he can get out, they get to the west in an area that is largely untouched by the Russians. They can direct, and they get to the west. Also, is where a lot of the armaments and a lot of the support and things are coming across the borders over there in that area, Moldova and that kind of area, that region. They can turn this into a long-term, a really, really ugly long-term pain in the neck for Putin.
Because it's helpful, and this is where your background in intelligence really helps. When you're listening to the news and you're listening to almost 200,000 troops and armaments and everything, it sounds overwhelming, like they don't have a chance. But when you put it in the context of, 180,000, 200,000 troops wouldn't be enough to surround Texas in any significant way. And
I'm sorry, and one thing about that too is of that 180,000, probably only I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. At tops, 50% of them are actual trigger pullers. It's actually less than that. I know it's less than that, but I don't remember the exact figure. So of that 180,000, a lot of them are logistical troops and that kind of thing.
Right. So you have that going on, but take a moment, if you would, to just speak to kind of what I think we're all feeling is the X factor, which is the inspiration of President Zelensky. There'll be a whole lot more for us to learn about President Zelensky, both good, bad, and ugly. But right now, it's just, I wrote an article last week that I think a lot of Americans are going, where is our Zelensky? Where is somebody that inspires with that kind of courage coming basically from nowhere? But from a military standpoint, from the mobilization of getting, moms and dads and grandmothers to pick up a rifle, from a military standpoint, talk about the inspirational power of that.
Oh, it's huge. I mean, I can tell you from example, depending on different commanders I served. Well, in fact, one of my first or second battalion commander was a gentleman who later became the chief of staff for President Trump, John Kelly, and I can remember literally standing in front of my mortar platoon that he had put me in charge of and telling me I'd follow that guy into hell. He's that good, and that my thoughts on him haven't changed at all. And of course that was just a battalion, but. Yeah, there are those men that set that tone. Zelensky happens to be, he may just be the right guy at the right time that history has plopped in this one place. I don't know a lot of his background, and that I'm sorry that I didn't do some research on that. But just the very fact that there is, history loves, smaller countries love the guy who is willing to stand up and shake his fist at the bigger, badder guy.
Good point.
And Zelensky is that guy.
Good point.
And he has there are things I really would like to know because I know he's Jewish, and that is a very important element I think in his thinking. I think he lost a lot of his family in World War II or in the concentration camps. So there's a medal to him from that, and there is a refusal to just just roll over and let Putin have his way. So. His defiance, and here's the thing, and this is both the great thing about him, but also the dangerous thing about him. His defiance and his willingness to stand there and say, "I'm not going anywhere. You're not getting me out of here. We're gonna fight." That inspires the average person who is hearing this or seeing this on TV, hearing this on the radio. And going, well, I can't get out of here. And if my president's getting out of here, well, gee, why do I want to stay and fight? But then they realize that my president, who is the guy that we know, we've heard, there's reports that Putin specifically wants to kill. There's hit squads after him. There's this, there's that. If they get the city, he's the first one they're going to march out and shoot. But he's going to stay with us and he's going to fight with us. That ratchets up the devotion right there.
Because nobody ever liked a bully, right?
Right.
And especially in the American mindset, we always love an underdog
Absolutely.
for sure.
Yeah, which is what he is. But that's also the downside, I think.
That's the downside, because when he, God forbid, he gets killed, then that causes the shock, that causes the hurt, that causes the loss of the movement to dramatically multiply.
I've been a student of Churchill's life over the years. I visited the war rooms any number of times. I'm reading another biography of him right now. It'll probably be the 10th one I've read. I'm just fascinated by his life and story. Part of it, and everyone's likening him to Churchill, and for all sorts of reasons, Zelensky and Churchill would out during the bombing raids, would get out, would walk around, almost shake his fist at the bombers, that sort of thing. Incredibly inspiring unless he had died.
Right.
And so you had these two sides in there. You had all his advisors that said, you're too valuable to do this. We can't let you do this. But the other side is his value was in part the fact that he was doing that. And so if Zelensky took Turkey's offer, the U.S.'s offer, and moved out to a government in exile right now, yes, he'd be alive. Yes, they wouldn't be able to kill him. And that's all that positive. But he wouldn't have the courage factor that he has coming in. And you're exactly right from what I understand about his story relative to Judaism in this piece. The Jewish population in the Ukraine, from what I've understood. And by the way, I need to stop saying this. I learned just today not to say the Ukraine. It's actually in the article I'm learning for tomorrow. The Ukraine is how Russia looks at this.
Right.
With a definite article. The in front of something says it's a region of something else, like the bluegrass country.
Right.
You wouldn't say the Kentucky. You would say the bluegrass country of Kentucky, So they'll call it the Ukraine. The Ukrainians just say Ukraine. And I'm having to learn to do that. I've heard the Ukraine for too long. All that to say, in Ukraine, the Jewish population, of course, has been a minority, as it has every place else, and they've always had to be the outsider looking in, always had to be that guy willing to stand up for themselves. So he brought that to the table to start with. He grew up in a family that had no observant Judaism at all because they were in the Soviet Union,
Right.
as he would say, although he himself says that he believes in God. He won't say more than that, per se. So you not only have this minority, Ukrainians versus Russians, you've got this minority within Ukraine whose previous experience, even though he has a law degree, is as a TV comic, essentially. And now, you couldn't make this up. You really couldn't make this up. And now he is the face of freedom and of courage in the midst of this. He gave the first talk in the British House of Commons ever given by a foreign dignitary in the history of the UK this week. First time they'd ever allowed a foreign dignitary to give an address to the House of Commons and got a standing ovation when he was done. And he cited Churchill in his address. He's brilliant on so many levels. Everyone always knew that. It just was what would he do with it? And so back to your point, Mark, I think, and this is something I think as believers we really can too often, I think, underestimate, is the significance of our own personal faith, our own personal courage, our own willingness to serve Jesus at a cost to us. We don't realize the degree to which that can be inspirational for other people, but it can. God can use our witness, our example, if we're willing to follow Christ at a cost. Other people see the reality of our faith. If all is well with us, people can say, well, of course you're following Christ. But when it's hard and you still trust Jesus? I remember this story about a family that lost 2 children to an influenza epidemic one winter. The next spring, they were there for Easter. The rest of the family was there. They sang the hymns. They celebrated the faith. As they were leaving the service, a little boy pointed at them and said to his dad, they really believe it, don't they? And the dad said, what? And he said, Easter. They really believe it. Well, I doubt that family ever knew the impact they made on that little boy. Just as Zelensky didn't know we were going to be talking about him here in this conversation. But if we'll follow Jesus with courage, other people will see that and see the difference in that. Well, I wondered if we could close, if we could, Father Barry, by asking you, if you would, to thank you for being a military analyst for us today.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Oh, no, my goodness. No, thank you so much for this. Close by being an Anglican priest, if you would, for just a bit. And share with us what you're sharing with your church. How are you asking them to pray? What is it that you're doing to help them through this time?
Well, I'm asking them to pray, obviously, for the protection of the innocents in the Ukraine. There is a prayer, and let me see if I can actually find it, that was sent to me. This was... my bishop sent this out. This was a message sent by Reverend Gavin Dunbar, who is of the Orthodox Church, or the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in America. And I'll read his preface and then the prayer. where he states, he says, most of the official Christian responses to the war in Ukraine have taken the familiar hand-wringing pacifist stance, complete with vacuous appeals for a diplomatic solution, as if Putin had any interest in diplomacy. That is utterly disconnected from the reality on the ground, where the citizens of Ukraine and the residents of Kiev are lining up to fight for their freedom. In contrast, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in America offered this prayer. And here is the prayer. We, your sinful children, turn to you with humility in our hearts and bow our heads low before you. We beseech your loving kindness and abundant blessings upon the nation, the people of Ukraine, during these days of great danger to their safety and well-being. Our brothers and sisters, Lord, are once again threatened by aggressors who see them only as obstacles blocking the path to the complete domination of the precious land and resources of the country of Ukraine. Strengthen the people as they face this great danger, turning to you in the immeasurably deep faith, trust, and love they have placed in you all their lives. Send your heavenly legions, O Lord, commanded by the patron of Kiev, Archangel Michael, to crush the desires of the aggressor, whose desire is to eradicate our people. To which I say, Amen. And I believe that is, there is, and all too often we become far too passive as Christians. Well, there is an aggressiveness that we should have in our prayers, and there is an aggressiveness in asking for God's justice. God is unquestionably a God of justice, and we see that throughout the Bible, and we see that even if we look back through the lens of history, which is a beautiful thing. And I'm praying, and I'm asking my church to pray, and I'm asking everyone to pray for God's justice to be brought in this situation. Because regardless of how we look at the politics of it, whether we understand all that, the simple fact that you have a larger nation that is killing thousands of innocent people, children, women, men, for no other reason than to satisfy whatever political ambitions that we've talked about here, none of that justifies the loss of one life. And what they are doing deserves God's interdiction and God's punishment, His justice to be worked out.
Amen.
So that's what I'm preaching and asking all of my brothers and sisters to pray.
And I would second that for everybody hearing this, that ought to be exactly the position we take. This is a spiritual war as well as a war on the ground. And at the end of the day, Satan comes to steal, kill, and destroy.
Amen.
And we're seeing stealing, killing, and destroying. So we know Satan is at work, but we know God is on his throne and God is bigger. And so we're praying to the King of the universe and asking him to be king over Ukraine. Yeah.
Father Barry, thank you for this wonderful conversation.
You so much.
Very helpful and insightful. I think our listeners will be greatly appreciative of your contribution. We hope to have you back sometime.
I hope so. I've enjoyed this. I'm honored and kind of surprised y'all wanted to listen to me this long. But
and thank you for your service
thank you.
to our
Yes,
country.
absolutely.
And now thank you for your service to our Lord.
That's a higher calling. That's a whole nother story. But that's a blessing in and of itself.
Yeah, thank you.
Really, thank you both. And I'm truly honored by this. I'm surprised to be here. So.
Well, as we wrap up, just want to thank our audience for listening with us today. And if you have questions, again, you can reach out to us at askjim@denisonforum.org. And if you like what you heard today, please share it with others and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you.